Hey guys. How's Danny?
Sick.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Johnson. I'm the director of the Seawolf Debate Program. I have a pretty good job. People seem to respect debate coaches, appreciating perhaps that we dedicate our lives to helping students develop the skills required to represent their interests in the democratic process. But I've come lately to suspect that our appreciation for debate may be somewhat misguided, inspired more by a question, namely our love for conflict. In her book, The Argument Culture, Deborah Tannen details the ways in which adversarial approaches to conflict pervade our daily lives. Our governance, our media, our sports, our legal system, and numerous other structures in our lives are based on the assumption that pitting individuals against each other is productive. Even the metaphors we use to describe the major problems that we try to solve reflect our love of conflict and a good fight. We wage wars on poverty, wars on crime, wars on terror, and, yes, even wars on drugs. But our passion for conflict can lead us to confuse a means for an end. Conflict in general, and debating in particularly, is not an end in itself. One means by which we try to reach the ultimate goal of good public policy. Unfortunately, when we lose sight of this distinction, we end up with what we seem to have now: political polarization, dysfunctional legislative processes, and a general sense that our interests are more different than they are shared. Debate is but one of the tools of democracy. It's an important tool, the most important tool. You see, the strength of debating is also its weakness. Debate implies that one side is right and the other side is wrong. It asks observers to align them with one position and to reject the other. Democracy, at least that function of democracy that seeks to balance the competing claims of legitimate interests, requires a great deal more thought than the reduction of issues to black and white, right and wrong. In addition to robust debate, a functional democracy needs tools like discussion and negotiation and compromise to frame good policy. And these tools require commitment on the part of the participants with differing positions and interests to treat one another with respect and consideration, to assume that there is some legitimacy to each other's beliefs, and most of all, to be open to encountering and understanding those beliefs. The topic we're considering tonight requires those same assumptions. Advocates on both sides have legitimate interests backing their positions. The legal status of marijuana is not, if you'll pardon the pun, cut and dried. Come on.
It wasn't even that good.
The 1975 Raven decision established that our constitutionally guaranteed right to privacy extends to the right to consume marijuana. It's undeniable that we have spent billions on the war on drugs, with little effect of stopping their consumption. The medical marijuana movement has established the utility of cannabis for treating legitimate medical ailments. And Colorado and Washington have demonstrated that it is possible to reverse the policy of prohibition. But it's also true that commercialization of marijuana in Washington has made more consumer cannabis more available on the market. Many of these products are significantly stronger than previously available versions of marijuana. Potency measures are not predictable enough to ensure that consumers know what they're going to get. And many of these new products come in the form of candies and confections that are appealing not only to the adults for whom they're intended, but to the children who otherwise might not have encountered them. Both sides of this debate have legitimate interests. Both sides operate from a posture of genuine concern for those that they care about and the society in which they live. Both sides are motivated by a desire to create good public policy. Both sides deserve to be heard. So I invite you tonight to be a true participant in our very own democratic act and to practice the golden rules of discourse. Listen to others in the way that you would like to be listened to. Express yourself in the way that you would like to be spoken to. Respect differing opinions in the way that you would like yours respected. But most of all, be civil, particularly to those with whom you disagree. And I have no doubt tonight that the debaters who have volunteered to participate will model that very civility. Representing the pro-legalization side are Taylor Bickford and Bruce Schultz. Taylor is a lifelong Alaskan born in Juneau, and he currently lives in Anchorage with his wife and daughter. He is the director of Alaska operations for Strategy 360, a national communications firm, and serves as spokesperson for the campaign to regulate marijuana like alcohol. He's a graduate of West High School and received his degree in science and philosophy from West Virginia University. Bruce Schultz is a small business owner and commercial pilot. Trained in architecture, he left that field and relocated to Alaska in 1996 to fly in the last frontier. As a lifelong Republican, Bruce believes that individuals should have the right to conduct their lives free of government interference as long as they do not adversely affect their fellow Alaskans. Bruce Schultz and Taylor Bickford. Speaking against legalization are Deborah Williams and Christina Woolston. A resident of Alaska for over 35 years, Deborah Williams has served as the executive director of the Alaska Lung Association, the Alaska Consumer Advocacy Project, and the Alaska Democratic Party. Active in numerous efforts to help our community, Deborah has received awards including the YWCA Woman of Achievement Award and the Anchorage Club Rotarian of the Year Award. Deborah's college degree was in biology and economics, and she practiced law in Alaska for many years. Christina Woolston was raised in the southwest village of Naknek, where she grew up commercial fishing with her family. Christina went on to graduate from Dartmouth College and has enjoyed a career in advocacy and economic development with a focus on opportunities in rural Alaska communities. She is the Vice President of Government Relations for Chenega Corporation, an Alaska Native Village corporation. She's been recognized as an Alaska Top 40 Under 40 and a National Native American Top 40 Under 40. Christina and Deborah. The motion for our debate tonight will be Alaskans should vote to legalize the production, sale, and use of marijuana. The debate will open with 8-minute speeches from both the pro side and the con side, followed by 5 minutes of questions across the aisle. After that, we'll repeat that same process with another 8-minute speech from the pro, and an 8-minute speech from the con, and 5 more minutes of questions across the aisle. From there, we'll turn the floor over to you so that you can ask questions of the debaters, and we'll do that for about 15 or 20 minutes. We'll then return back to the stage and give each team one 5-minute summary speech to close. On the screen behind me, you'll notice that we have a poll on which you can register your vote for or against the motion, or if you'd prefer, to reserve your judgment until after the debate. If you'll take a moment now to text one of these codes to the number 22333, we'll capture the sentiment of the audience before the debate begins. At the end of the debate, we'll repeat that process and open voting again, and based upon these two polls, the side that has moved the audience the furthest will be declared the winner for this evening. And a quick reminder, once you've voted, please take a second to silence your cell phones so that you can be fully present in the moment with us tonight. A few groups deserve our thanks for helping make this debate happen. We're indebted to UAA for its continued support of the Seawolf Debate Program. We're pleased to have formed a partnership with the Alaska Dispatch News to produce this debate. And as always, we're grateful to the Beartooth Theater for its great community space and hospitality. And Mike Jipping, who is the Director of Special Events for the Beartooth, asked me to remind you that this is a no-smoking venue, which seems particularly relevant this evening. With that, then, I would like to call the House to order, to call upon the first speaker for the pro side to speak on behalf of the motion that stands in his name. Hear, hear.
All right, thanks for being here tonight. My name is Bruce Schultz, and I'm here to advocate for better, more sensible marijuana laws that actually accomplish something constructive. Like other volunteers on this campaign, I'm an Alaska resident. There are other Alaskans in Fairbanks, Kenai, Southeast Alaska, Western Alaska, and elsewhere, not to mention the over 40,000 Alaskans who signed the petition to get this issue on the ballot. I mention this because you may hear someone suggest that this entire initiative is some outside influence plot to subvert Alaska. It's not. Now, as Steve mentioned, I'm an unlikely advocate for ballot measure 2 because I work in an industry with mandatory drug testing, and I take that very seriously, so I don't indulge in marijuana myself. However, I have in the past, and as far as I know, it didn't kill me or cause me to go stark raving mad, as far as I know. In contrast to my own personal experience, I have known people, some very close to me, who have ruined their lives with alcohol, meth, cocaine, heroin, and prescription drugs, every one of those. So when I consider marijuana relative to other substances, I feel that I have a pretty good perspective on what marijuana is and what it is not. As voters prepare to go to the polls on November 4th and vote on ballot measure 2, it's helpful to consider exactly what it is we're being asked to decide. Now, it's our contention that ballot measure 2 is a solution to a fundamentally flawed and ineffective policy that is marijuana prohibition. Some of you may be familiar with the history of marijuana prohibition in this country, but many of you likely are not. It started in 1937 amidst a tidal wave of uneducated, bigoted hysteria. The charge was led by Harry Anslinger, a former alcohol prohibitionist, who believed, and I'm quoting here, that the primary reason to outlaw marijuana was its effect on the degenerate races. Let that one sink in for a moment. It gets better. He goes on to say that reefer makes darkies think they are as good as white men. This is a quote. And that smoking a joint makes you likely to kill your brother. Now, let me just add, I'm uncomfortable even reading this stuff out loud, okay? And I can't decide what's more troubling. The fact that somebody thought that, the fact that they said it out loud in front of Congress, or the fact that so many people bought that as a legitimate argument. I think that's a sad commentary on the state of our culture at that time. That was the origin of marijuana prohibition. 80 years later, can we honestly look back and conclude that it was a good idea? Today, the federal government is spending nearly $8 billion a year to fight a failed war against a substance that 75% of Americans believe is safer than alcohol. We've arrested millions of Americans for the victimless crime of marijuana possession and incarcerated tens of thousands more for growing and selling marijuana. And for what? Marijuana remains the third most popular intoxicant in the country, and by any objective measure, the consumption of marijuana is far less costly to the individual and to society than the two most popular intoxicants, alcohol and tobacco, which together kill over 500,000 Americans every single year. Unlike alcohol, marijuana use does not lead to violent sexual assault or overdose deaths. So let's talk about the current legal climate. The most common misperception concerning marijuana in Alaska is that it's already legal. Steve referred to the Raven decision. The fact that the notion that it's illegal is not at all accurate, and unfortunately our opposition has worked very hard to try and perpetuate that myth. In fact, in Alaska, someone is arrested every 4.32 hours for marijuana possession. Person every time, that would be awkward. 81% of all drug arrests are possession, which is the single highest rate in the country. According to the ACLU, Alaska spends upwards of $14.5 million annually on possession laws alone. Yet despite that, Alaska has the highest rate of marijuana consumption in the country. Roughly 15 to 18% of Alaskans consume marijuana on a semi-regular basis. That's 1 in 6, or roughly 120,000 people. Now, these are not stereotypical stoners playing video games in their parents' basement. These are professionals. They're business owners. They are politicians in some cases. They're entrepreneurs and everyday folks who simply choose to relax or socialize with something other than alcohol. Now, it's true that the state courts have ruled that possessions of small amounts in one's home are protected by the individual's right to privacy, but you cannot legally buy or sell it. So, unless it magically appears in your home, you're out of luck. Buying or selling marijuana, even amongst adults, can get you arrested and could result in your home, your vehicle, and other property being seized and with the proceeds going to law enforcement agencies. Let that one sink in. That's happening now in America. One of the concerns shared by folks on both sides of this issue is the availability of marijuana to Alaska kids. The reality is that marijuana is much easier to obtain than alcohol for those under 21. Most people would be reluctant to buy alcohol for a teenager because of the consequences if they get caught. Someone who is selling marijuana to a high school student isn't going to ask for proof of age, and there is no incentive for them to do so. Ask any teenager, and they will likely confirm that they know a handful of dealers from whom they could buy marijuana. In fact, 80% of teens surveyed said that it was easier for them to obtain marijuana than alcohol. That was true when I was in high school some years ago. That's true today. Worse yet is that the same people selling marijuana to those teenagers may also have access to hard drugs that are truly dangerous. Now, consider the impact on individuals and their families for even a minor marijuana offense. Despite assurances from some prohibitionists, Alaskans can most definitely be arrested for selling, trading, or possessing marijuana, even in small quantities. They're often faced with huge legal bills, fines, loss of employment, inability to get jobs later on, and forfeiture of their home and property, not to mention the prospect of serving jail time. According to the Alaska Department of Public Safety, there have been over 8,000 arrests for marijuana possession since 2004. And all of this over the cultivation, sale, or consumption of a substance which is, by any objective measure, far less hazardous than alcohol. Clearly, marijuana prohibition is a failed policy, and it's time for a new approach. Ballot Measure 2 is a solution to that flawed and ineffective legal policy. The initiative is titled An Act to Tax and Regulate the Production, Sale, and Use of Marijuana. It seeks to handle our existing marijuana industry in a more sensible way. By taxing and regulating marijuana, we can end an existing $100 million black market industry and replace it with a legitimate industry regulated by sensible guidelines. Ballot Measure 2 includes specific provisions of existing legal rights, maintain an employer's right to enforce a drug-free workplace, allow local control by individual communities, and to create sensible guidelines on packaging, marketing, potency testing, and quality control of all marijuana products sold by licensed businesses. By issuing permits to legitimate businesses, we would create an incentive for them to market and sell marijuana products only to those 21 and over, just like alcohol. That outcome alone would achieve in a few years what 80 years of prohibition has failed to accomplish. Taxes collected from wholesale transactions would more than offset the cost of implementation, and the additional savings to law enforcement could be well over $15 million annually. The attempt to control marijuana use in this country through prohibition has been a monument. The marijuana industry in Alaska is a thriving multi-million-dollar industry that is entirely untaxed and unchecked. We could continue with prohibition and beat our heads against the same issues for another 80 years, or we can choose to regulate marijuana the same way we do alcohol, create a legitimate industry run by tax-paying entrepreneurs following sensible rules and employing thousands of Alaskans. Thank you.
I just began, Steve? Okay, great. Thank you. Twin victories in Colorado and Washington, a widespread lack of information about what was included in Alaska's proposed initiative, and advocates for this measure telling us passage was inevitable. Why, in the face of all of that, would anyone stand in the way? Factor in that we knew the Marijuana Policy Project in D.C. had already opened its checkbook, and the Yes campaign pledged to spend and do whatever it took to win. Knowing all of this, the question that had to be asked was, why would we bother? As a group of diverse Alaskans gathered around a dining room table this past spring, that question was certainly asked. But another one was asked too. After reading and discussing what was actually in this ballot initiative, these volunteers challenged each other, how can we not stand up to oppose this? We read the language in this measure, what it protects, what it allows, and we were stunned. We tuned into the statistics, studies, and personal stories coming out of Colorado, and we had deep concerns. Almost every time we spoke to another Alaskan about what was actually contained in this ballot measure, they were troubled too, and many of us joined. Many of them joined us. So this grassroots campaign that started in a dining room with just a handful of Alaskans grew to dozens of organizations and thousands of Alaskans who have come together from all walks of life, from every political persuasion, from all over Alaska, and for a wide variety of reasons, unified behind one simple, important truth, that no matter how you feel about marijuana, Ballot Measure 2 is bad for Alaska. So we stepped forward and we asked questions, challenged the assertions being made by the advocates, and took our points and our concerns to as many Alaskans as possible, 5, 20 Alaskans at a time. But it was all to deliver our message. This measure is not about legalization of marijuana. It is about the creation of a vast commercial marijuana industry. The yes side responded, waging a war, to Steve earlier, of personal attacks, just like they did in Colorado, against anyone that dared to challenge them. We've been called all kinds of names, some more colorful than others, over the past 6 months trying to engage in a reasonable discussion around this issue. And we can agree on one thing, and I do want to point this out, that it is incorrect what Bruce had said. The personal possession of marijuana is not prohibited in Alaska. It is legal. And the UAA Justice Department has even said, and they show it on their map, that marijuana is decriminalized in Alaska effectively. And we have no issue with that. We've also said repeatedly that we're in favor of an Alaskan approach to fixing some of the issues around how we deal with marijuana. Our problem with this measure is that it is not about making things better in Alaska, unless, of course, you believe creating a vastly expanded availability and use of another harmful substance is actually good for Alaska. This is an outside-funded ballot measure, and it's written by the same group that wrote Colorado's law, creating a new industry. They have pervasive advertising, pervasive retail pot stores. Do you know in Denver there are now more pot stores than there are McDonald's and Starbucks combined? There's a never-ending There's a never-ending pipeline of new marijuana products being introduced. Candy, cookies, soda, vape pens, even butane hash oil, and other concentrates. The Yes campaign wants us to believe extreme products can be banned. Well, in Colorado, when regulators tried to do that, the marijuana industry pushed back so hard, those regulators just this week gave up. The horse is out of the barn, they say, and those extreme products are there to stay. Why do we think it would be any different in Alaska when these products are expressly protected in the ballot measure? Read the language. Any form of marijuana, including concentrates, which can be up to 90% THC, would be legal. The Yes campaign wants you to believe passing this law will free Alaskans from prison and free law enforcement to focus on other more serious crimes. The Alaska Association of Chiefs of Police, or ACOP, disagrees. Every single one of the Alaskans currently in jail for a marijuana-related offense would still be there if their offense happened, if after this became law. And ACOP says the cost for training and enforcement of this new law would outweigh any potential tax revenues or cost savings. But among the most unfortunate assertions made by the Yes campaign is that marijuana use by our youth will actually go down. They cite statistics in Colorado that show a slight decline since the first of the year, but fail to mention that the top 2 school districts, including Denver, chose not to participate in the study because poor results in these things can affect their funding. And they failed to mention that since marijuana became more widely available in Colorado after the commercialization of medical marijuana, that the use of youth has actually gone up 25% in Colorado. And that's a lot of new young people using marijuana. Are we willing to risk that? Now, what about alcohol? The Yes campaign slapped big banners on the side of our city buses touting that marijuana is safer than alcohol. It is a campaign trick to distract Alaskans from what this is really at stake. We have never disagreed that alcohol is a significant problem all over our state. But marijuana is not safe, especially for young, developing brains, and it is costly in terms of DUIs, emergency room visits, workplace issues, and more. The Yes side wants you to believe that alcohol consumption will go down if this ballot measure passes, that Alaskans will stop drinking and start using marijuana. Where is the proof? The burden of proof is on them, and we haven't seen it yet. But there is some evidence. Out of Colorado, since their law went into effect the first of this year, tax receipts from alcohol sales have actually gone up, not down. More marijuana and more alcohol, too. And what about our local option? They drafted the law with large exemptions for transport and transfer, so rural communities cannot ban it like they can alcohol. There is no local option. This means even villages that are dry in alcohol can't stop the possession and transfer of marijuana, and that includes highly potent marijuana concentrates. We have a lot that we can learn from the experiment in Colorado. We're learning real time every day, but this is what we know so far. Tax revenue has fallen far short of projections. Colorado voters were told they would raise $130 million in the first year. Through 9 months, they've raised $21 million. Colorado is raiding its general fund to pay for the implementation of their initiative, including training of law enforcement. The black market in Colorado is thriving. Black market pot is everywhere because it is cheaper. Local governments were told that they could forbid retail, but now they realize that they were lied to. Lounges and large cooperatives with untaxed personal use pot are springing up in areas that have tried to forbid retail marijuana. Colorado has big problems with edibles and concentrates, including butane hash oil. ER visits are up, and that includes young kids. There have been over 30 butane hash oil explosions just this year from people making it at home because it's cheaper and it's legal. Positive workforce drug tests are up 23%. Crime is up, homelessness is up significantly. There is still so much that we can learn. Why don't we wait to see how things pan out in Colorado? Even their governor calls the decision reckless, and just 9 months in, many Coloradans are feeling voters' remorse. If the election were held today, likely voters would vote it down, and that should tell us a lot. If we pass this on November 4th, we're not putting the genie back in the bottle. Please ask yourself when you go to the ballot booth, have proponents of this measure met your burden of proof that this will be good for Alaska? We think a majority of Alaskans will respond with a resounding no. Thank you.
We're going to give the debaters a chance to ask each other some questions now, and the way it's going to work is like this. Each team is going to get about 2 opportunities to ask questions of the other side. They've agreed that they'll take no more than 1 minute to respond to the questions that are framed by them. So we're going to have bells that will indicate when their time to answer those questions has elapsed. We're going to give the first question to the pro side, and they can direct that to the con side. So gentlemen, whenever you're ready.
So this was talked about in both Bruce's introduction and yours as well, Christina. I think most people recognize that marijuana is safer than alcohol. It's something that 75% of Americans believe. And we know that in Alaska, alcohol is a major contributing factor to violence, sexual assault, domestic abuse in communities throughout the state. Marijuana use, on the other hand, is not associated with any of those things and does not cause people to be violent. If a person in this state If a person in this state would like to make the safer choice to use marijuana instead of alcohol, why should they be prohibited from doing so or worse, criminalized?
So con side, you have a minute to respond.
Well, we've said all along that this really isn't about alcohol. This is about what's in the ballot measure. And what we do know and what we agree is that Alaskans should come together with a solution around the ways that we deal with marijuana. We disagree that Alaskans are being incarcerated for marijuana possession because the Department of Corrections has told us so and because the Alaska Association of Chiefs of Police has told us so. But what we do know is that we can't regulate this like alcohol. This is a completely different subject matter, and we need to treat it uniquely. And so you cannot compare, even from a legal standpoint, the 2 measures. So when we look at this and the way the ballot measure is written, it does not give us an option as Alaskans, as a state, as communities, to control this substance or to have local option around it.
All right. So our next question will be from the con side, directed to the pro side, whenever you're ready.
Do you still believe that it is, quote, wildly irresponsible, close quote, to estimate revenues from the commercialization of marijuana in Alaska? If your answer is no, why have you not provided any estimation yet in a timely and responsible manner?
Gentlemen, 1 minute.
So Deborah, as somebody who's had to interact with the media from time to time, I think you recognize that sometimes statements get taken out of context. In the conversation I had with the reporter that you're referencing, what I said was wildly irresponsible was the extent to which your campaign had come up with back-of-the-napkin projections about revenue and presented that to Alaskans as fact. She asked us if we would do the same thing. In other words, if the campaign was going to put together its own revenue projection, and I said, no, we're not, because to do so from a political campaign rather than economists and statisticians who understand how this actually works would be wildly irresponsible, and so we've declined to do that. So I never said it was wildly irresponsible to do revenue projections. I said that it was wildly irresponsible to represent political posturing as fact to voters.
The next opportunity for a question goes to the pro side. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. For either Deborah or Christina. Alaska has the highest rates of marijuana use in the country. Marijuana is widely available and used in the state. You object to a legal, regulated market, but the alternative is to leave the industry in the criminal underground, which is where it currently exists. Why are we better off having criminals in control of this industry rather than regulated businesses who pay taxes and follow the rules?
1 minute for the con side to respond.
As we stated previously, the underground market in Colorado and Washington is alive and well. It is thriving. There is no evidence whatsoever that if we pass this initiative, that the underground market will be diminished. We, as Alaskans, believe there is a better approach than that which is being proposed by ballot measure 2. An approach that does not do the kind of extreme commercialization that you are seeing in, and that is costing Colorado significant amounts of money and is in significant health impacts. And so our position is this is the wrong law for Alaska.
So our final question. Our final question will come from the con side, directed to the pro side. Go ahead.
Former State of Alaska Prosecutor Dean Gwinelli has stated that ballot measure 2 provides much less local control over marijuana than communities currently have over alcohol. This is because the initiative explicitly allows transporting, transferring, and personally cultivating and processing marijuana everywhere. Because the local option is so much diminished for marijuana than for alcohol, this is just another example of how you cannot regulate the two substances in the same way under the initiative. Do you have any evidence to refute this?
1 minute to the pro side.
Well, I think the unique thing about marijuana in Alaska is that our state Supreme Court has found over and over again that it is not dangerous enough in and of itself to violate Alaskans' right to privacy when it comes to what you do in the privacy of your home. Alcohol, on the other hand, they found is dangerous enough to make that invasion of privacy. And so when it comes to marijuana, it is unconstitutional to ban possession. You cannot do that in any state or area of the state now, whether you live in Akiak or Anchorage or Ketchikan or any other place in the state. The initiative could not have banned home possession of marijuana, or it would have been struck down as unconstitutional. And so the extent to which transport is allowed is necessary to stop people from getting arrested for simply possessing a substance that's safer than alcohol. And that should exist anywhere in the state. There's nobody in the state that should be arrested for having marijuana.
Well, with that exchange out of the way, we're going to now return to an opportunity for each team to have some time to represent further their positions and to engage the arguments from the other side. So we'll return now to the pro side to hear another 8-minute speech in favor of the motion.
So before I get into the specific arguments made by Christina in her constructive speech, I want to just briefly touch on something that for me has been one of my biggest disappointments about how this process has gone forward, and that's the extent to which the Vote No campaign and its representatives have sought to engage in essentially the politics of personal destruction when it comes to this issue. This ballot initiative is on the ballot because 45,000 Alaskans signed a petition to qualify it for the ballot. It only got to that point because people like Dr. Tim Hinterberger, who's in the audience, Bill Parker, who's in the audience, and a handful of others who have been committed to marijuana policy in the state for nearly 20 years, saw what happened in Washington, Colorado, and decided it's time for us to try this again. We have thousands of volunteers across the state in every community from Barrow to Ketchikan to Anchorage to Western Alaska who are working every day to end what they see as incredibly oppressive and failed policies. And as somebody who was born in Alaska, who's lived here for most of my life, who's raising his family here, I have gotten really sick and tired of every time we get into one of these debates or forums that we have to sit and listen to the other side suggest that this is all some big ploy from the outside, that it's being put forward by people who don't care about Alaska, who want to see children use marijuana, who want to market marijuana to children. And I would just ask that, at least for tonight, that we heed Steve's comments from the beginning, and let's focus on the issues and stop trying to tear each other down, because at the end of the day, we all care about Alaska. We just disagree about the best way to move this issue forward. So I think it's really important for us to recognize what it is we're not deciding in November. We are not deciding whether marijuana should be in the state or not. I think there are honestly a lot of people who plan on voting no because they think that they'll eradicate marijuana from the state by doing that. We have the highest rates of marijuana use in the country. We have over 100,000 adults in Alaska right now using marijuana, and by all accounts, people are doing it pretty responsibly. We are also not deciding whether a marijuana industry should exist in this state. The entire purpose of the opposition campaign, which is calling themselves Big Marijuana, Big Mistake, is to try to scare you about the perceived horrors of a regulated marijuana industry. The fact of the matter is we have 100,000 people in the state that are using it now, and because of that, we have a multi-million-dollar underground industry that is totally unregulated and sales are being conducted by individuals who have no incentive whatsoever to follow the rules, and that's because there are no rules. And so voting no on this initiative does not stop marijuana from being in the state, and it certainly does not keep an industry out of the state. It just decides that the industry will be unregulated in an underground rather than regulated. So in recognizing that marijuana is here to stay, and that we already have a very large marijuana industry in the state that isn't going anywhere, we have to ask ourselves, what is the point of prohibition? What exactly are we spending millions of dollars a year to prevent? And the fact is, supporters of ballot measure 2 agree with people like former Alaska Chief Prosecutor Lori Constantino, who is saying marijuana prohibition laws just aren't working. In fact, they've caused far more problems than they've solved. We know that it's not working, and we want a more sensible approach, and that's what ballot measure 2 offers. There's not a whole lot of time here. I can't specifically respond to all of the points made during the constructive speech from the other side. So I've tried to group those arguments into categories to sort of address them all at once. And the first category of issues are issues that are raised that supporters of this ballot initiative believe will actually be better addressed and better handled through regulation rather than prohibition. And the most obvious example of that is teen use. Teen use of marijuana in Alaska is rampant. Prohibition has done absolutely nothing to stop teens from using marijuana. We all care about this. Nobody wants kids or teens using marijuana. We just recognize that what we're doing now isn't actually working. Under our current system, we have illegal dealers and street dealers that are specifically targeting children, and they're doing it pretty successfully. Now, the opposition will argue that ending prohibition doesn't end the black market, and their whole basis for that argument is looking at less than a year's worth of data out of Washington and Colorado. First of all, both of those states have transferred hundreds of millions of dollars out of the black market into a legal regulated market. And so it's totally ridiculous to suggest that the black market has somehow gotten stronger or that hasn't been impacted. Of course it has. But I think we just have to use common sense, and we have to understand that there are longer term implications to this. When we ended alcohol prohibition in this country, did speakeasies and bootlegging just magically disappear overnight? Of course not. And that's because you're dealing with an entrenched underground market. But over the long run, people typically don't want to be arrested for buying something, and so if they have the opportunity to buy it in a legal environment where quality control is in place, where they actually know what they're getting and they're not risking arrest, they're going to do that. And there is a reason today why we do not have a thriving underground market for alcohol, we do not have a thriving underground market for tobacco, and it's because when you have the choice between a legal market and an illegal market, over the long run you transition to the legal market, and we'll see the same exact thing with marijuana. And so we have seen in the real world that regulating marijuana works. It can actually make it harder for kids to access it because you have establishments that are checking for ID, and as the legal market takes the black market over, that's where the majority of the market is going to exist. In the state of Colorado, their Department of Revenue earlier this year conducted a massive sting operation trying to find just one example of a licensed dispensary selling marijuana to minors. They found zero cases of licensed regulated dispensaries selling marijuana to minors. Additionally, the state's Department of Health, this isn't a third-party organization, this isn't an organization that's funded by federal dollars that are there to promote the policies of prohibition. This is the state agency looking at what is happening in our state. They look at, they do a survey of 40,000 high school students every year. Christina mentioned that there were 2 high school districts that weren't included in the survey. They still talk to 40,000 high school students in the state. And they found that since the state began regulating marijuana for medical use and regulating marijuana for adult use, that rates of use amongst teens has actually gone down. Now, it's not a significant decrease, but the extent to which the opposition has tried to argue in Colorado and Washington that this would lead to huge increases of use, it just hasn't happened. So there are all sorts of issues when it comes to kids, when it comes to promoting safer communities. that you can accomplish better when you regulate something and you have a legal structure to be able to make decisions together as Alaskans. And that leads me to the second category, which is either a gross misunderstanding of what the ballot measure actually says or a deliberate attempt to misinform people about the structure of the ballot initiative. So there are concerns related to advertising, related to edibles, related to the amount of dispensaries, and all sorts of other things that will be handled as part of the rulemaking process that this initiative establishes. The initiative itself establishes a framework. And after the initiative passes, there will be a 9-month rulemaking period under which a state regulatory agency will make these sorts of decisions with input from Alaskans. So when it comes to advertising, edibles, all these other things, we can handle that together as Alaskans during the rulemaking process, and there's no reason to believe we're going to have a free-for-all situation where there's a marijuana dispensary on every corner. And thank you.
Most of us have had an experience of seeing a terrific sounding ad and buying something that, when we actually tried to use it, was not what we thought it was. Like many others, I did not have my mind made up when I first heard that there was going to be an initiative on the ballot regarding marijuana. But then I carefully read the initiative and reviewed what was going on in Colorado and read peer-reviewed studies. Like so many others, after doing that, I concluded that this initiative, which is all about the commercialization and industrialization of marijuana in Alaska, is too costly and is the wrong approach for Alaska and Alaskans. I would like to talk about some of the things that the Vote Yes folks have mentioned tonight and in other forums. And I'd like to start with impact on usage by youth. Here is the real relevant fact. When you look at how much alcohol underage youth use and compare it with marijuana, what you find, for example, is that even though the yes folks say marijuana is more accessible, that for 12th graders, twice as many 12th graders consume alcohol on a regular basis than smoke marijuana. What that represents is the fact that the regulation of alcohol has not worked to keep alcohol out of the hands of minors, because they don't try and get it from alcohol stores, they get it from others. And what you're dealing with here is for a lot of growth, twice as much. And is that what we want for Alaska? Is that what we want for our youth? The possibility for a lot of growth in use, alcohol use. And use not only of what most people are familiar with, leafy marijuana, but edibles and concentrates. And that leads to something else. You don't hear the yes folks talk about the definition of marijuana in this initiative, and we urge you to please read it carefully. You are to be lawmakers when you vote on this initiative. And it is useful to know what the definitions are. And the definition of marijuana in this initiative is actually more extreme than that in Colorado, because it includes not only every aspect of marijuana, and it includes edibles, but it also very explicitly includes concentrates. And as Christina mentioned, concentrates contain 80 to 90% THC. We don't know all of the scientific impacts of concentrates, which is one reason it's important to wait and see what this new world of marijuana looks like, just like the new world of marijuana edibles. But we certainly can see out of Colorado and Washington that there is reason for tremendous concern and reason to wait. The yes side talks about the underground market. And again, we all know that the underground market in Washington and Colorado is thriving. And there is no reason to believe that that is really going to substantially change, because the other thing we know about growing marijuana is that it is relatively easy to do. It's a lot easier to do than making other products. And so, but one thing that we also know that's incorporated in this initiative is that this initiative specifically allows the processing of marijuana into products such as butane hash oil. And this is one thing that, again, many of us who came into this without a decision about this, but when we looked carefully at the specific language, we're really surprised to see words like processing and remuneration and others, indicating that, yes, this initiative would specifically legalize people to process marijuana using processes like butane hash oil in their homes, apartments, and condos. And what we have seen in Colorado is that the number of butane hash oil explosions, which cause tremendous damage and burns, have increased dramatically since legalization. The Yes side has said many times that, well, you won't have as much processing of marijuana into butane hash oil and shatter and crumble and earwax if you legalize it. But in fact, again, the evidence, once more, when you look at what's going on in Colorado and Washington, is contrary to the assertions that the Yes side is making. The one thing that we really urge people, because it was so impactful on us and all the Alaskans who have taken a hard look at this, and as you know, and as was passed out, it's a very long list of very thoughtful organizations. Medical, boroughs, law enforcement, corporations, Native organizations, and others, all who have taken a very thoughtful look at this, again, coming to this without their mind made up, but looking at the language and the experience in Colorado and saying, this is indeed the wrong approach for Alaska. So the Yes side will talk a lot about, well, let's just regulate marijuana like alcohol. But the fact of the matter is, the way this is written, and this initiative is essentially identical to the initiative that was passed in Colorado, almost word for word, is that you really can't regulate marijuana like alcohol with this initiative. So you can't regulate marijuana like alcohol under this initiative for so many reasons, including the fact, as we've pointed out, that local communities cannot prohibit the transport of marijuana into their community, which includes the transports of concentrates and the transports of edibles. They cannot prohibit the transfer among people without remuneration, which means cash. And even in communities that vote to prohibit retail, as we have seen in Colorado, there are these many loopholes in this language which prevent communities from determining their own destiny and their own preferences on this. In Alaska, we take local option very seriously. And unfortunately, this initiative precludes local option, both in its explicit language and in terms of its loopholes. So the Yes side has said they're not going to estimate the revenues. We did our best. It wasn't, it was just our. And we've seen what happened in Colorado. There are so many promises in Colorado that were not met by the Marijuana Policy Project, the major funder of this initiative. So many promises not met, and one was revenue. People who have looked at this initiative carefully have come to the conclusion that this will cost Alaska more money than it could possibly bring in. And given that we are going into a period right now of tough financial circumstances with the price of oil, we cannot afford something this costly, this extreme, and this adverse to Alaskans. Thank you.
My thanks again to the advocates for those speeches. We're going to give them another chance now to ask some questions of each other, and once we're done with that, we'll turn the opportunity over to you. So let's start again with the pro side. Question phrased for the con side, please.
So Deborah and Christina, you guys have made two inherently contradictory arguments when it comes to the black market. On the one hand, you have argued that passing this initiative will create a massive commercial industry. On the other hand, you have argued that passing this initiative will not eradicate the black market. So which one is it? Will this create a commercial industry that people are going to participate in, or will people continue with the black market?
We believe that the evidence shows that youth use will increase if this initiative is passed. And all sales to youth are associated with black market and are illegal. So the black market will increase to meet the demand that will be created by this initiative for sales to youth. And we also believe that this will increase other use. And so that will be responded to by the black market. So many periodicals have pointed out that the black market not only is thriving in Washington, Colorado, but is especially thriving in minority communities and disadvantaged communities. And that is one of the many communities that we are concerned about, but especially youth.
All right.
I would also add that this whole industry is predicated on sales, increasing sales, bringing in new customers. It's a for-profit industry. It's a retail industry. It uses advertising, marketing to promote its products. So that would also be a part of it.
Which means people are using the commercial industry, not the black market.
Let's hold on a second. We're going to make sure that everybody gets a chance to give their questions. Our opportunity now to ask a question goes to the con side. You can ask a question of the pro side.
In Colorado, tax revenue is overwhelmingly due to tourists, and they have about 14 million tourists that visit their state every year. They've seen about $21 million in tax revenue. Alaska has 7 times fewer population. Edibles in Colorado are a major part of the sales, and they are also a major problem in part because they are so attractive to children. In fact, Hershey's was just as successful in suing one of the manufacturers of an edible in Colorado. They've also resulted in a lot of emergency room visit increases. What are the percentage of sales of marijuana you project will be edibles in Alaska? Do you think it will be more or less than the 45% of which it is in Colorado, and why?
Pro side, 1 minute to respond.
Well, I'm not sure that we can necessarily extrapolate from other states what the percentage of edibles will be in Alaska. However, the rulemaking process that's defined in ballot measure 2 specifically allows for regulating of those edibles, the packaging, the labeling, and the distribution. So I think that whatever that distribution is, it can be handled responsibly.
Right. Back to the pro side for a question of the con side.
Okay, there's been some mention of a butane hash oil as being hazardous and treacherous. Curiously enough, a lot of people in the state didn't even know what that was until the no side brought it to the forefront. I had to ask myself. I had to ask somebody to explain this to me. So you said that there have been 30 incidents where butane hash oil processes went awry. If you adjust for the difference in population between Colorado and Alaska, that would equate to roughly 3 incidents in Alaska. Some would argue that if you, in a regulated industry where you move those extraction processes and condensate processes to a legitimate industry that's done in an industrial manner by trained people, some would argue that that would shift the home use of butane hash oil away from people who aren't trained. Do you not see that as a likely outcome?
Well, in Colorado, they didn't know what butane hash oil explosions were either until legalization. Chief Kirk,
Give her a chance to respond, please.
that'd be great, thanks, was just up here talking to us about the way that they've had to really learn a brand new way to respond to public safety issues in their community, and butane hash oil is significant, 31 since January, and they didn't know what they were either. But the fact is, it's cheaper to make it at home, and you take all of the moldy byproduct, you take all of the leftovers, and you in Colorado on stores in, convenience stores, they now sell the tubes by which you can pack these products and make your own butane hash oil at home, everyday stores. The fact is, even regulated and commercialized manufacturing plants that make butane hash oil end up in explosion 50% of the time or in fire. Look at California. The data is out there. In Colorado, 50% of their processing facilities have also ended up in an explosion or fire. When you add butane and you add fire and you add a chemical process, it is highly volatile.
So the last question then will go from the con side to the pro side.
Colorado now has pervasive marijuana advertising, and 2 publications have brought lawsuits against the state to challenge restrictions on advertising. There are full-page ads in newspapers using child-friendly images, magazine ads, airplanes flying overhead with banners, and people standing on corners advertising marijuana like the Liberty Tax Guide. Do you think, given the constitutional right of free speech and the Supreme Court's decision that have the right of free speech, that marijuana advertising can be banned and that marijuana corporations won't challenge such bans?
Pro side, 1 minute for a response.
Well, I think the entire question is predicated on the notion that use is so dangerous that adults shouldn't be doing it in the first place, which I think is erroneous. But if you look at what the initiative actually lays out, it actually compels, this isn't an option, it compels the state regulatory board to place reasonable restrictions on advertising. We've seen this happen in a number of other industries. We've seen this happen with alcohol, tobacco, and other things. And yeah, there are gonna be lawsuits maybe, but that doesn't mean that you can't place restrictions on these things. So I think you need to look at this realistically, understand that the initiative specifically requires that restrictions are placed on advertising, understand that we've been able to successfully do this with tobacco, alcohol, and other things, and then just fundamentally recognize that a little bit of advertising isn't the end of the world.
So now we come to that portion of the debate where you'll get a chance to ask some questions of our debaters. But before we go to the mics, I want to recognize a few ground rules. Number 1, behave yourselves. We have a diverse audience of individuals here who are interested in critically considering this issue. Please don't derail the process with profanity, insults, accusations, or name-calling. Number 2, speak for yourself. Start by telling us who you are and temper your expression with consideration that you have an exclusive corner on the truth. And number 3, treat others with respect. Don't ascribe motives to those with whom you disagree, and criticize the positions and not the people. And always remember that while your right to express yourself may be guaranteed by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, being heard is a privilege that you must earn. So, if you would like to ask a question of the debaters, raise your hands up now. We've got a couple of students in the program who will run a mic up to you and give you a chance to ask a question. And ideally, the questions would be directed in such a way that both pro and con could weigh in on them. So keep that in mind.
Okay, so because I get to be first with the microphone, I'm going to take a little bit of extra liberty and ask 2 questions, but I promise they'll be fairly quick. My name is Drew Kaysen. I'm most of my life Alaskan. So my first question is, if marijuana use among high schoolers is 50% that of alcohol, what do you think the use amongst adults is? I think if about 20% of adults use marijuana on a regular basis, it's got to be way higher than 40% drink alcohol on a somewhat regular basis. So it sounds to me like proportionately, there's actually far higher marijuana use by your own numbers. The second question comment.
Let's get a response to the first question first.
Okay.
So what is the relationship? We'll go to the pro side first. What is the relationship between the estimates of people who consume, or young people who consume alcohol versus consume marijuana, and how does that relate to the adults?
I don't have the data in front of me. I don't know the specific answer to that, but I think what is logical and common sense is that the suggestion that was made by the opposition that passing this ballot measure will double use amongst teens is obviously not true. And I think you have to understand that there is no single group in the state or demographic that has better access to marijuana now than teens do. Any teen in the state that wants to find marijuana, if that's something they want to do, they're going to go out and do that. And prohibition hasn't actually stopped that from happening. So I can't specifically answer your question, but I think obviously it's not going to double, or else we'd be seeing the data coming out of Colorado in a much different way.
Thank you for your question, Drew. And in general, thank you for the UAA debate team and this whole effort, which is really impressive, and as you did, we just want to applaud the UAA debate team, and I know Drew was a distinguished member of the UAA debate team, so thank you, Drew. What we know is, of course, that, as I said, twice as many 12th graders are using alcohol than marijuana right now. The reason we brought that up was because the yes side keeps asserting that marijuana is more available to youth than alcohol. That statistic either refutes that or suggests that there are other reasons that youth are using alcohol less. And what the behavioral health science shows is that one of the main reasons that youth either choose to use something or not use something is their perception of risk and their perception of parental approval or disapproval. And the evidence shows that when perceptions of risk go down, use rate goes up. And what we also know is that when something is legalized, perceptions of risk go down. And so that would mean that use would go up because the perception of risk is declining. So there's every reason to believe that legalizing and commercializing marijuana the way that this does it, the way that Colorado is doing it with its rampant youth-friendly products, youth-friendly advertising, and youth-friendly everything else that would make, and again, I was involved in tobacco in the 80s. The first wave of tobacco made Joe Camel look pretty primitive. This is very sophisticated advertising, and it is designed to reduce perceptions of risk. And so, yes, we would certainly expect youth rate to go up significantly because of the crass commercialization associated with this initiative.
All right. Drew, because I do know you, I'm going to make sure that somebody else gets a chance to speak as well. So if there is another question out there that we have, if there is out there that we could turn to.
Yes, hello, my name is Aaron. I've lived in Alaska for over 20 years, and I thought for sure when this came up on the ballot, I would be pro-marijuana. I've had some hesitancy recently, and a lot of that comes from listening to debates that I've heard on the radio or via the internet, the Alaska Dispatch, whatever. To the con side, I would say, you've mentioned the wording of the law, and it creates a lot of loopholes for whatever. But I don't feel like any of those loopholes were seriously addressed, and that's kind of why I'm on the fence and why I'm here tonight, is to kind of dissect this bill and find out what specific loopholes are we missing in the wording, so if this does pass, we can address that locally, and if it doesn't pass, we can get it right the next time, because I would agree that our current stance isn't working, and I think we need to work together to find a better solution.
All right. So we'll turn that one to the con side first. What
That's it.
loopholes would you like to highlight?
Okay, great, thank you. And that is a great question and a great point. What we know about the language is that it was virtually the same as Colorado. Our ballot measure is 8 pages, theirs was 12, Washington's was over 60 pages, and that's why we're seeing a fairly different situation there. Specific language in the bill, and there are a number of them, but the first one is the inclusion of, you can gift up to an ounce, and that includes concentrate. Definition of marijuana includes concentrates, things like butane, hash oil, and others, where up to an ounce can be up to 1,200 doses. You can gift it to somebody without remuneration or cash exchange without paying for it. In Colorado, what they're seeing, they've had smokehouses pop up, and you can pay for a cover charge and go in and use for free. There are delivery facilities, a retail shop in one community, and they will deliver to another community where they have banned retail stores for a delivery fee. And you can deliver up to an ounce for the cost of the delivery fee without remuneration. The other loopholes that we are seeing in, and the other thing that you addressed was in the rulemaking process. Well, as Alaskans, our Constitution protects voter legislation, and this is voter legislation. We can only regulate up to what's in the ballot measure. So anything in terms of the definition, the controls, the local options, it specifically says you can transport into every community in Alaska. These are all things that take away our ability to control, and you can't substantively, that's a hard word for me, anything within 2 years of the ballot measure passing, and we only have 9 months to create a regulatory process, and we only have a 90-day legislative cycle. And Washington had 2 years in very specific language in order to get their hands around this. And I did mention local control. Local control is something that is of great concern, being from a rural community, working a lot in rural Alaska. as Deborah said, we do take our community's rights to have local control. Half of the state of Alaska does not fall under the definition of local government as is outlined in the ballot measure language. And so half of Alaska would not be able to prohibit the commercial industry in their communities. So those are just a couple of the pretty significant gaps in the regulatory ability in this measure. And we do agree that a thoughtful Alaskan approach is the right approach, but not this one. Thanks.
Thank you for the con side. We'll give the pro side a crack at that question as well.
Like you, I've also lived in Alaska for most of my life, and what I've found in this state, whenever a ballot initiative comes up, is that the no side bases their whole campaign on this idea of, well, we sort of agree with you, but this just isn't the right way to do it. You see it in every issue, and it's a political tactic to try to get you to vote no. In this state, too often, we get to the point where we agree on core principles and values, like marijuana prohibition hasn't worked, for example. And then we get so stuck arguing over the details that we can't make progress on these issues. And what Ballot Measure 2 offers is a chance to take a step forward and to make progress. It specifically establishes a rulemaking process where whatever loopholes or things you're concerned about can be ironed out. It's also not at all accurate to suggest that the Alaska Constitution prohibits ballot measures from being amended. What the Alaska Constitution reads in Article 11 is that if a majority of the votes cast on the proposition favor its adoption, the initiated measure is enacted. If a majority of the votes cast, it's rejected, the lieutenant governor shall certify the election returns. An initiated law becomes effective 90 days after certification and is not subject to veto and may not be repealed by the legislature within 2 years of its effective date. It may be amended at any time. Okay? So we've heard this in multiple debates, multiple forums. This idea that we can't amend the ballot initiative is factually incorrect. You can't repeal it. You can't change it so significantly that it alters the definition of what the ballot measure is intended to do. But when it comes to issues and loopholes and things like you're addressing, that can either be handled during the rulemaking process or it can be handled by the legislature as early as next session before a legal market is rolled out. So don't buy into the hype. Do not subscribe to this notion that we're locked into exactly what's in the ballot measure for 2 years because, number one, the ballot measure has a provision that is set up to amend itself and to write the regulations. That's what the ballot measure asks for. And number two, within that 2-year time frame, the legislature, local governments, et cetera, have really broad authority to enact measures that impact it as long as they're not repealing it and as long as they're not significantly changing the outcome. So if your intention is that we as Alaskans make these decisions and perfect the law, that's exactly what the initiative allows for.
Right.
Yeah, I've got a question for you down here. Don Hart, I got a question for you. I know I've heard so much statistics quoted from you over the fourth time I've heard them. I've been to 3 previous debates to them. And you cite so many statistics like a college professor that's gone through these things, but there's not a single one you've shown where it came from. Actually, put them up where people can see them. And one of them that you used to, one of the debates where you said that the National Transportation Safety Study proved that people under the influence of marijuana were so dangerous that they had a lot more accidents, that there were more deaths, there were more people seriously injured as a result of people being under the influence of marijuana. And 2 actual National Transportation Safety Studies that we have defy what you just said. They say that the actual government actually tested people under the influence of marijuana in 2 separate National Transportation Safety Studies and proved and stated people under the use of marijuana, under the influence of marijuana, while driving under these federal government studies, are safer drivers. They slow down, they're more careful, they're more cautious.
We're gonna give the debaters a chance to respond to that now. So let's go to the pro side first. Driving and marijuana. Driving and marijuana certainly is a concern. The use of intoxicants while driving is obviously something that we're all concerned about. What would you say to that in response to that question?
Well, I mean, I would agree with the general statement that, I would not encourage anyone to consume any intoxicant and operate heavy equipment, whether it's a car, bulldozer, a truck, or an airplane. I mean, I don't think that's responsible. That said, I think your point is a good one. A lot of the studies that are cited are often misleading or incomplete. For example, you might hear a report that an individual got into a horrific auto accident and they had marijuana in the system. What they don't go on to say is that that individual's blood alcohol content was 4 times the legal limit. So they leave you to believe that marijuana was the cause when it may not have been at all. So honestly, I think a lot of the statistics that we're seeing in opposition to this ballot measure are at best skewed.
All right. We'll give the con side a crack at that question as well.
Thank you for your question. We do urge everyone in the audience and who is listening into this to go on to Big Marijuana, Big Mistake, Vote No On To website. We do cite every statistic that we use. We have numerous fact sheets, all of which are carefully cited and annotated, and we do stand by the facts that we have. I would like to say two things that are related to this, and that is one thing with respect, we care a lot about worker safety in Alaska, and that, again, you can go and look at the citation on this. Workers who test positive for marijuana use have 55% more industrial accidents, 85% more injuries, and a 75% increase in absenteeism compared to non-smokers. I would like to really take issue on behalf of all of these distinguished organizations and individuals throughout the state in saying that our concern about this initiative is political. This initiative is fundamentally flawed. And when you try and make the number of amendments that you would have to make to remove the tremendous fundamental flaws of this, you would be substantially repealing this initiative, and it would be deemed impossible to do and illegal to do by the Alaska courts. And so this is not just a few things. This is so fundamental. And so we do believe, and our legal experts believe, that the magnitude of the problems associated with this initiative are so great that they cannot be fixed without violating the Constitution in terms of a substantial repeal of this law. So it is not something that can be legally or effectively amended.
All right. If you want to, sure.
Sure. So Don, you specifically, I believe, asked about the statistic that I've given a couple of times. So, absolutely, and we respectfully ask for more than platitudes from the yes side as well. But this particular statistic comes from the Rocky Mountain High Impact Drug Traffic Assessment, I believe is what it's called. And so this one was specifically looking at what happened in Colorado, because that's what we're really trying to do here, is look at what a specific piece of legislation would do to our state. And the best case scenario is to look at Colorado because they've done so. So what they've shown in Colorado is that between the time, and this was just what they have from the commercialization of medical marijuana, that there was a 114% increase in traffic fatalities where the driver tested positive for marijuana. And so those are this.
We're going to give her a chance. We're going to give her a chance to answer. There'll be plenty of time for discussion after, I
but
promise.
that's the statistic that I believe that I've been using in our presentations, and it's based upon information that a third-party study has done based on the federal government and what they've seen coming out of Colorado specifically. The other statistic that this same organization has put out in terms of use after just legalization, and the problem is that their true statistics aren't available for another year because it's compiled at the end of the year. But what they've been able to see so far is that impaired driving is up. And in California, where they have commercial medical marijuana, there are now more impaired drivers under the influence of marijuana than alcohol. So there is verifiable statistics out there, and it's called the HIDA report, and it's used very widely in terms of trying to discern the statistics out of a state that has commercialized and legalized and industrialized marijuana compared to other states where they may not have that same legal status.
All right, pro side, I'm going to give you another chance since I gave them a little extra time. You can either continue to respond to this question, or we can go on to another question from the audience.
I'll be quick. The Rocky Mountain High Drug Trafficking Unit is not a third-party organization. It is an organization that's its stated purpose is to enforce and maintain the policies of prohibition. It is funded. These studies are funded by the same. These studies are funded by the same federal government that thinks marijuana is as dangerous as heroin. So I don't think you can look at really anything that the Rocky Mountain Drug Trafficking Unit puts out as a credible fact.
All right. We appreciate your questions. I would love to continue to have this discussion in a one-on-one fashion as much as I would love to. We do have a movie that's eventually going to be shown in here that the Beartooth would like to have the opportunity to show. So we are going to move now at this point to the summary speeches from each side. Before we do, though, I'm going to ask our visual aid tech to put the closing poll on the screen behind me. This is our end of the debate poll. It's the same sort of approach where you can use your cell phone to text in your opinion for, against, or neutral on the motion. We will use the difference between the pre-debate poll and the post-debate poll to decide the winner. The other thing that I wanted to make clear is that we're going to give the we're going to give the opportunity to the con side to make their argument first, and we'll close then with a summary speech from the pro side. So at this time, we'd like to invite the con side speaker to come up to give their 5-minute summary speech. Please come on up.
Well, we're just 12 days away from the election, and we have a very important decision to make. When we close that curtain behind us, there are many questions we should be asking ourselves. If you believe that Alaska should lighten up on marijuana, if you believe we should make it easier for medical marijuana patients to get their medicine, ask yourself this. To solve these challenges, do we need to open the door to a commercialization of all marijuana products? Are we ready for retail pot stores? Are we ready for pervasive advertising? And are we ready for a steady stream of new marijuana products like we've seen in Colorado? Are we ready to deal with the many issues that Colorado is currently struggling with? Disappointing tax revenue, more stone driving, more accidents, increased homelessness, more failed drug tests and the implications for a ready workforce, problems with edibles and concentrates, butane hash oil explosions, and a black market that hasn't disappeared but is actually thriving. No ability for local communities in Alaska to keep marijuana and marijuana concentrates out, even native villages that are dry in alcohol, even villages that have been devastated by the scourge of substance abuse. Do all of these things sound like positive steps for Alaska? You know, this week we listened to the brave young women from Tanana, one of many villages in Alaska struggling with a wide variety of serious social ills, many of them caused by substance abuse. The Tanana 4-H Club came to Anchorage this week. They stood up at the Elders and Youth Conference and then today at the full convention at AFN to plead with Alaskans that ballot measure 2 will only make their heartache worse. Or should we listen to the Marijuana Policy Project, who admittedly doesn't care? Their executive director has said this is really about a national strategy for them, and they can't afford to lose this campaign in Alaska. They see us as a pawn, and they are working to legalize everywhere. Should we buy their plan that they have spent over $800,000 trying to sell us, the same plan they brought to Colorado? Do we believe that we can regulate marijuana like alcohol, despite all of the evidence that in Alaska it is impossible to do? And I'd like to just point out that on our website there is a lawsuit in Colorado that it's legally unclear if you can even tax it. So the assertion that you will tax and regulate marijuana like alcohol is even being contested in Colorado as whether or not it's even legal to do. Can we afford to trust them that everything will be just fine despite what we've seen in Colorado? Despite the facts that folks there are having buyer's remorse, that after just 9 months, voters would actually vote it down